On the 6th of March, 1940, somewhere in the frozen forests of eastern Finland, a Soviet bullet struck a Finnish soldier in the face. It tore through his lower jaw and left him so badly wounded that, for a time, men around him thought he was dead. The soldier disappeared from the battlefield. Rumors spread. Then, 1 week later, he opened his eyes. It was the 13th of March, the same day the Winter War ended. The man who had survived was Simo Häyhä, a farmer, hunter, and quiet reservist who would become known as the most lethal sniper in modern military history. But the legend of the White Death hides something even more interesting than a kill count. Because the real reason Häyhä became so effective was not a magical rifle, impossible eyesight, or superhuman courage. It was that he understood something his enemy initially did not. In a frozen forest, the environment itself could become a weapon. Before soldiers feared him, Simo Häyhä was simply a farmer from southeastern Finland. Born in Rautjärvi in December 1905, close to the Russian border, he grew up hunting, skiing, working outdoors, and competing in shooting. None of this looked extraordinary at the time. In rural Finland, knowing how to move through snow or judge distance across a forest clearing was part of everyday life. But years of hunting had quietly trained exactly the abilities modern snipers spend enormous effort developing: patience, observation, distance estimation, control of movement, understanding wind, and the discipline to wait for a target instead of forcing a shot. Then Europe began tearing itself apart. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed their non-aggression pact. A secret protocol divided parts of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, and Finland fell within the Soviet sphere. From Moscow's perspective, there was also a serious security problem. Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's largest and most important cities, sat dangerously close to the Finnish frontier. Stalin's government demanded territorial adjustments on the Karelian Isthmus and sought a lease for a naval base at Hanko, offering other Soviet territory in exchange. Finnish leaders saw the demands very differently, giving Moscow strategically important territory they feared could make Finland progressively harder to defend and threaten the independence the country had gained only in 1917. Negotiations failed. On the 30th of November, Soviet forces crossed the frontier. On paper, the comparison was brutal. The Soviet Union had an enormous population, thousands of tanks, a huge air force, and millions of men available to its armed forces. Finland had only a fraction of those resources. Soviet planners had every reason to believe mass, armor, artillery, and air power would overwhelm Finnish resistance. Yet, the Red Army was entering a battlefield where numerical superiority did not automatically translate into useful combat power. Look at Finland from above. In the south, between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, lay the Karelian Isthmus, the most obvious route toward the Finnish interior. This was where Finland concentrated much of its army, behind the defensive positions later known collectively as the Mannerheim Line. But move north of Lake Ladoga and the battlefield changes. Roads become fewer. Forests become thicker. Lakes, swamps, ridges, and snow break the landscape into narrow corridors. A large mechanized army might possess overwhelming firepower, but if its trucks, guns, kitchens, ammunition, and infantry all depend on a handful of roads, that army can become long, predictable, and vulnerable. U.S. Army historical studies of warfare in the region later emphasized precisely this problem. The pathless terrain and poor road network made large formations difficult to maneuver and supply. This was the world Simo Häyhä understood. His war would be fought around Kollaa, north of Lake Ladoga. The men from his home region formed an important part of the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, commanded by Reserve Lieutenant Arne Juutilainen, a hard-driving officer who had previously served in the French Foreign Legion in Morocco. Kollaa became one of the Winter War's stubborn defensive fronts. Soviet troops repeatedly tried to break through. Finnish soldiers repeatedly stopped them. The position mattered because a successful Soviet advance through this region could threaten Finnish forces operating north of Lake Ladoga and widen the crisis far beyond a single frozen river. Häyhä entered that battle with a weapon that looked almost primitive compared with the equipment people now associate with elite snipers. His principal rifle was a Finnish M2830, developed from the Mosin Nagant family. Most remarkably, he preferred iron sights rather than a telescopic scope. That decision sounds like a disadvantage. At long range, magnification helps identify and engage targets. But Häyhä's environment changed the calculation. Using iron sights allowed him to keep his head slightly lower. There was no lens to reflect sunlight, no optic to fog or become difficult to use in severe cold. And most important, he was already intimately familiar with the rifle. His advantage was not having the most advanced system. His advantage was knowing exactly what his system would do. That is the first major lesson of Häyhä's story. Battlefield technology matters, but familiarity can matter just as much. A weapon you understand instinctively can be more useful than a technically superior weapon you do not. Häyhä's rifle was reportedly zeroed around the distances he expected to fight at, and the forests around Kollaa often limited sight lines anyway. This was not open desert sniping across enormous distances. Trees, snowbanks, uneven terrain, and vegetation compressed the battlefield. A Soviet soldier might appear for only seconds between trunks or above a position. Häyhä had to recognize the target, estimate the distance, fire, observe what happened, and disappear again before the enemy understood where the shot had come from. And firing was only a tiny part of the process. The real work happened before the shot. Häyhä prepared positions carefully. Accounts of his methods describe him packing or hardening snow around the front of his firing position so the rifle's muzzle blast would not throw loose powder into the air and reveal him. He used natural cover and low positions instead of dramatic sniper nests in trees. He could reach a prepared location before daylight and remain there for hours. Movement had to be controlled because movement attracts the human eye faster than shape. White camouflage helped him disappear against the snow, but camouflage alone was never enough. A rifle barrel, a shadow, disturbed snow, vapor from breathing, or one impatient adjustment could betray everything. Imagine the psychological discipline required. The temperature can be far below freezing. Your fingers are becoming less responsive. You cannot move simply because your back hurts. You cannot stand because your feet are numb. Somewhere ahead, men with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery are searching for you. If you fire, they may not know exactly where you are, but they now know you are somewhere nearby. So you wait. That waiting is one reason the popular image of a sniper can be misleading. Sniping is not primarily about pulling a trigger. It is about information. Who is moving? Where? At what distance? Which route are they using? Has the enemy seen you? Is the shot worth revealing your position? Can you leave afterward? Every successful shot creates another problem: survival after the shot. Häyhä became extremely good at solving that problem. As his effectiveness increased, so did the danger. Enemy snipers searched for Finnish marksmen. Mortars and artillery could attack suspected firing positions without ever seeing the individual soldier hiding there. Tapio Saarelainen, a Finnish army officer who later interviewed Häyhä extensively, described episodes in which indirect fire struck close to his positions. The fundamental equation was changing. Häyhä might have been one man, but the enemy could answer one rifle with weapons capable of destroying an entire patch of forest. Why devote that kind of effort to a single shooter? Because a sniper's military effect is larger than the person he actually hits. Consider a Soviet unit trying to advance through forest. If soldiers believe a hidden marksman can see them, movement slows. Officers become more cautious about exposing themselves. Reconnaissance becomes harder. Men hesitate before crossing open ground. Soldiers who should be watching forward begin scanning trees and snowbanks for something they may never find. The sniper imposes uncertainty, and uncertainty consumes time. That matters on a battlefield where Finland desperately needed time. The Finnish defensive system could not permanently overcome Soviet superiority in manpower and firepower, but it could make every mile expensive. Across the northern fronts, Finnish ski troops exploited forests and poor roads to strike supply columns, isolate formations, and attack from unexpected directions. Soviet troops often fought with great determination, but their formations initially suffered from poor preparation, command problems, weak reconnaissance, inadequate adaptation to the terrain, and the effects of Stalin's purges on the officer corps. The Finns understood that they could not fight a Soviet-style war. They had to force Soviet units to fight a Finnish-style war. Häyhä was almost the perfect expression of that strategy. He was small, experienced outdoors, comfortable in isolation, skilled with a rifle, and familiar with winter movement. But calling him naturally gifted misses the most important part. His later explanation for his skill was famously simple. Practice. Behind that single word were years of repetition, judging distance, controlling the rifle, reading terrain, hunting, skiing, and learning how small changes in weather affect what a shooter can see and do. Then his reputation began escaping the battlefield. Finnish newspapers needed symbols. The country was fighting a vastly larger power. Civilians were being bombed, soldiers were dying, and nobody knew whether Finland would survive as an independent state. Stories about extraordinary individual fighters had enormous propaganda value. Häyhä became one of those figures. Reports of his growing tally circulated. Photographs were taken. On the 17th of February, 1940, he was presented with an honorary rifle. A quiet farmer was becoming a national wartime icon. And somewhere in that transformation, the legend of the White Death grew. The famous version of the story says Soviet soldiers themselves gave Häyhä that name because they feared the invisible Finnish sniper dressed in white. But history is rarely that clean. Later research has raised doubts about exactly where the nickname came from. Finnish wartime propaganda repeatedly used imagery of an invisible white-clad defender, while some evidence suggests expressions translated as White Death among Soviet prisoners could refer more generally to the deadly frost and winter forest, not specifically to Häyhä. The association between Häyhä personally and the nickname became much stronger in later storytelling. So the title that made him immortal may reveal as much about wartime mythmaking as it does about Soviet fear. And the same problem appears when we reach the most famous number attached to his name. 505 Mich for Simo Häyhä today, and you will repeatedly see versions of the claim that he achieved 505 confirmed sniper kills in less than 100 days. Some accounts give even higher totals. That figure has made him the standard answer to the question, who was history's deadliest sniper? Major military history publications and museums have repeated it, And Häyhä himself later estimated in a private wartime memoir that he had shot roughly 500 Soviet soldiers. But here is the detail that changes the entire story. The historical record does not support treating 505 as a perfectly audited modern statistic. Finnish wartime documentation gives lower rifle totals at specific points. Records cited in later research list 138 by the 22nd of December, 199 by the 26th of January, 219 by the 17th of February, and 259 by the 7th of March, the day after Häyhä was wounded. Historian Risto Marjoma has argued for a figure of more than 200 rather than accepting the larger traditional number uncritically. Other tallies appear to combine rifle kills with enemies attributed to Häyhä while fighting with a Suomi submachine gun or as part of ordinary infantry combat. Confirmation on a chaotic battlefield was inherently difficult. Bodies might remain in enemy territory. Multiple soldiers could engage the same target. Records could be incomplete. Propaganda created incentives to celebrate extraordinary totals. So was the legend false? No. That is what makes the truth more interesting. Even the more conservative wartime documentation describes an astonishingly effective marksman operating during an extraordinarily short campaign. The uncertainty changes the precision of the number, not the basic reality that Häyhä was exceptionally lethal and that his reputation was earned in actual combat. History does not need 505 to make him remarkable. In fact, focusing only on that number can make us misunderstand him. A sniper does not stop an army by personally destroying hundreds of soldiers. Armies are stopped by defenses, logistics, artillery, infantry, command, terrain, morale, and operational decisions. Häyhä's importance came from being one part, an unusually effective part, of a Finnish system that turned local knowledge into combat power. Thousands of Finnish soldiers were freezing in trenches, carrying ammunition, operating machine guns, evacuating wounded men, patrolling on skis, and fighting Soviet attacks. Häyhä became the face of that resistance because an individual story is easier to remember than an entire defensive network. But while his legend was growing, Finland's strategic position was becoming more dangerous. The Soviet military learned. That may be the most important development of the entire Winter War. After the disastrous opening phase, Stalin placed Semyon Timoshenko in overall command of the main offensive. Soviet forces reorganized, trained for more coordinated attacks, improved reconnaissance and preparation, and concentrated enormous artillery and manpower against the Finnish defenses on the Karelian Isthmus. Instead of assuming Finland would simply collapse, the Red Army began methodically creating the conditions to break it. In February 1940, massed Soviet attacks breached key portions of the Mannerheim Line. Finland had shown that Soviet power could be hurt. It could not make Soviet power disappear. This changed everything at Kollaa as well. For months, the phrase "Kollaa holds" became a symbol of Finnish resistance. But holding did not mean safety. Soviet pressure intensified, Finnish forces were exhausted, and every casualty mattered more to the smaller army. Infantry Regiment 34 was temporarily rotated away from the immediate front and then called back as Soviet forces threatened the sector from another direction. On the 6th of March, Finnish troops counterattacked near Ulisma. Häyhä was no longer simply waiting alone behind a rifle. He was operating as the group leader in active infantry fighting. Then came the bullet. A Soviet soldier fired, and Häyhä was struck in the lower left jaw by an explosive projectile. The damage was catastrophic. He lost consciousness and was evacuated. Stories circulated that he had died. The man who had spent months avoiding detection had finally been found. Yet he survived. He regained consciousness on the 13th of March. The day the fighting ended, Finland had not won the war in the conventional sense. Under the Moscow Peace Treaty, it surrendered substantial territory, including much of the Karelian Isthmus. Hundreds of thousands of Finns had to leave homes in areas transferred to Soviet control. Häyhä's own home region was affected by those territorial losses. The Soviet Union had suffered immense casualties and worldwide embarrassment, but it ultimately possessed the reserves and firepower to force Finland into peace. Finland lost land. What it did not lose was its independent state, and that distinction mattered enormously. The Winter War also produced lessons that extended far beyond Finland. Foreign observers saw a huge Soviet military perform disastrously during the opening campaign. Some concluded the Red Army was fundamentally incompetent. That judgment would have consequences. German planners later looked at Soviet weaknesses with growing confidence before Operation Barbarossa. What received less attention was the second half of the Winter War. The Soviet ability to identify problems, reorganize, concentrate overwhelming force, and eventually rupture strong Finnish defenses. The Red Army of December 1939 was not exactly the same force Finland confronted in February 1940. That is another reason Häyhä's story should not become a simple tale of one perfect sniper humiliating an incompetent enemy. The Soviet soldiers he fought were human beings trapped inside the same frozen war. Many were poorly prepared for the conditions. Many suffered because of decisions made far above them. They endured cold, hunger, artillery, ambushes, and fear. Many continued attacking despite enormous casualties. Recognizing Häyhä's skill does not require turning the men on the other side into faceless targets. Every number in a sniper tally represents a human death. Häyhä himself appears to have understood the weight of that reality better than many versions of his legend suggest. His recovery was long. His face remained permanently scarred, and he endured numerous surgical procedures. The war had made him famous, but fame did not restore what had been destroyed. He returned to farming, hunting, and breeding dogs. He lived quietly for decades and rarely built his identity around his wartime record. When asked late in life how he felt about what he had done, he framed it not as personal glory, but as fulfilling the duty assigned to him in defense of Finland. He died in 2002 at the age of 96. By then, the Soviet Union itself had disappeared. The young farmer who once waited motionless in Finnish snow had outlived the superpower whose soldiers he had fought. And that brings us back to the question hidden underneath the legend. What actually made Simo Häyhä so dangerous? Not simply his rifle, not simply camouflage, and certainly not a mythical ability to never miss. His advantage was the combination of preparation, terrain knowledge, patience, concealment, marksmanship, and an army fighting on ground it understood better than the invader. He reduced his own weaknesses and forced the enemy to operate inside conditions that favored him. He did not try to dominate the entire battlefield. He controlled a tiny piece of it. Then another, then another. That is strategy at its smallest scale. And when thousands of soldiers do versions of the same thing, using forests, roads, weather, mobility, intelligence, and discipline to deny a stronger enemy the battle it wants, small tactical advantages can accumulate into strategic consequences. The Soviet Union still forced Finland to surrender territory. Häyhä did not change that outcome by himself. No sniper could, but his story reveals something more useful than the fantasy of an unstoppable gunman. Military power is never just a calculation of who has more soldiers, tanks, aircraft, or artillery. Power must be converted into effective action. Terrain can interfere with that conversion. Logistics can interfere with it. Training can interfere with it. Fear can interfere with it. And a defender who understands those weaknesses can make an enormous army pay for every mistake. That is why the real Simo Häyhä is more compelling than the legend. The legend gives us a number. History gives us a system. A farmer practiced until his rifle became familiar. A hunter learned to read forests until almost invisible details mattered. A small country understood that it could not match Soviet strength directly, so it tried to make Soviet strength difficult to use. And for 98 days, inside one of the coldest and most unforgiving battlefields of the Second World War, those pieces came together. Whether the final total was 259, approximately 500, 505, or another number that can never be reconstructed with certainty. One conclusion survives the uncertainty. Simo Häyhä became extraordinarily effective because he mastered the battlefield before he tried to master the enemy. And perhaps that is the part of his story worth remembering. Not the mythology of death, the discipline behind survival. If you want more stories where the legend is separated from the battlefield and where tactics, geography, and human decisions explain what really happened, stay with this channel, because military history becomes far more powerful when we understand not only who fought, but why the battlefield produced the outcome it did, and that lesson did not disappear with the Winter War. Modern snipers use far more advanced equipment than Häyhä ever possessed. High-powered optics, laser rangefinders, thermal imaging, suppressors, specialized ammunition, digital communications, drones that can search miles of terrain from above. But technology has not eliminated the principles that made Häyhä effective. In some ways, it has made them even more important. Because the modern battlefield is watching almost everything, a soldier who stays in one place too long can be detected by a drone. A muzzle flash can expose a firing position. Radio transmissions can reveal locations. Thermal sensors can detect body heat. Artillery can strike coordinates within minutes, or sometimes much faster. The sniper's problem has changed, but it has not disappeared. The question is still the same. How do you see the enemy without allowing the enemy to see you? Häyhä answered that question with snow, patience, terrain knowledge, and discipline. A modern sniper might answer it with camouflage, electronic awareness, reconnaissance drones, carefully controlled communications, and rapid displacement after firing. Different century. Same principle, survival depends on controlling information. And that is where Häyhä's story becomes larger than one soldier. Because warfare is ultimately a competition over information. Who sees first? Who understands first? Who reacts first? And who can hide what they are doing until it is too late for the enemy to respond? A sniper compresses that entire problem into a single human being. He watches, he waits, he chooses. Then, for one brief moment, he reveals himself. The rifle fires. And immediately, the information battle begins again. Where did the shot come from? Was there one shooter or several? Is the position still occupied? Should infantry advance? Should artillery fire? Should the route be abandoned? Should officers expose themselves? Every unanswered question creates hesitation, and hesitation can spread through an entire unit. This is why the psychological effect of a sniper can sometimes exceed the physical damage he causes. A machine gun announces its presence. Artillery announces its presence. A tank can often be heard before it is seen, but a concealed sniper creates a different kind of fear. You may not know where he is. You may not even know whether he is still there. The forest becomes suspicious. The ridge becomes suspicious. The window becomes suspicious. The snow becomes suspicious. And suddenly, the battlefield seems to be watching you. That fear can alter behavior. Soldiers move faster across exposed ground. Commanders use more cover. Patrols become cautious. Movement becomes less predictable. Sometimes that caution saves lives. Sometimes it slows operations. And sometimes fear produces mistakes. Häyhä understood this instinctively because hunting had taught him a fundamental truth. The target rarely knows exactly where the hunter is. But the hunter must understand exactly where the target is likely to go. That means predicting movement. And prediction begins with terrain. Imagine looking across the Kollaa front not as a soldier, but as a hunter. There is a road, soldiers need that road, because deep snow makes movement difficult. There is a clearing. Anyone crossing it will briefly lose concealment. There is a small rise. An observer standing there can see farther, so officers and scouts may be attracted to it. There is a narrow section of forest between two obstacles. Movement naturally funnels through it. Suddenly, the battlefield becomes a map of probabilities. You do not need to watch every square meter. You watch the places human beings are most likely to use. That is one of the quiet secrets behind effective defense. Terrain channels behavior. Roads channel vehicles. Bridges channel armies. Mountain passes channel supply lines. Ports channel shipping. And on the smallest possible scale, a gap between trees can channel a single soldier. If you understand the channel, you can anticipate the movement. If you anticipate the movement, you gain time. And in combat, a few seconds can become an enormous advantage. This helps explain why Finnish familiarity with local terrain mattered so much during the Winter War. Many Finnish soldiers had spent years skiing, hunting, farming, logging, and traveling through similar landscapes. The forest was not empty space to them. It had structure. Snow depth mattered. Tree density mattered. Frozen lakes mattered. Road direction mattered. Temperature mattered. Even silence mattered. For invading troops unfamiliar with those conditions, the same landscape could feel almost featureless. White ground, dark trees. Frozen air. No obvious enemy. That imbalance in familiarity became a combat multiplier. But it also created another misconception. The Winter War is sometimes remembered as if Finnish soldiers defeated Soviet forces mainly because they were tougher in the cold. That is far too simple. Cold weather is not automatically an advantage for the defender. Cold kills defenders too. Weapons malfunction. Frostbite destroys combat effectiveness. Engines become difficult to start. Food freezes. Wounded soldiers die faster. Seat becomes harder. Every movement consumes energy. Every exposed piece of skin becomes a vulnerability. The Finnish advantage came from preparation and adaptation, not immunity. They knew how to layer clothing, how to move on skis, how to use shelters, how to operate in forests, how to exploit frozen terrain, and how to remain mobile where heavier forces struggled. Häyhä represented that same principle at the individual level. He did not defeat winter. He learned how to work inside it. That difference is crucial. Military history repeatedly punishes armies that assume the environment is simply a background. It is not. The environment is part of the battlefield. Heat changes warfare. Rain changes warfare. Mud changes warfare. Mountains change warfare. Cities change warfare. Deserts change warfare. And in Finland, snow and forest transformed the relationship between manpower and mobility. A large unit could become trapped by its own size. A small unit could disappear. A road could become a lifeline, and therefore a target. A sniper could exploit the same geometry. The fewer safe routes the enemy has, the more predictable the enemy becomes. But prediction alone does not create success, discipline does. And this may be the least cinematic part of Häyhä's story, which is exactly why it matters. Most of his battlefield experience was not dramatic. There were no constant explosions, no endless duels, no heroic speeches. Much of it was cold. Silence, waiting, watching, controlling breathing, refusing to move, refusing to fire at the wrong moment. That kind of discipline rarely appears impressive until the second it becomes decisive. Modern audiences often imagine elite soldiers as people who react faster than everyone else. But some of the best soldiers are dangerous precisely because they do not react unnecessarily. They conserve movement, they conserve ammunition, they conserve information. They wait until the situation favors them. Häyhä's effectiveness depended on this restraint. Every unnecessary shot could reveal him. Every unnecessary movement could reveal him. Every poorly chosen position could trap him. So survival required something harder than aggression. It required control. And that control mattered even more because he was operating against an enemy with vastly greater firepower. If Soviet troops identified his position accurately, Häyhä could not outgun them. He could not defeat artillery with a rifle. He could not overpower a company by himself. His protection came from preventing the enemy from developing a clear target. This is a useful way to understand asymmetric warfare. The weaker side rarely wins by matching the stronger side weapon for weapon. It tries to prevent the stronger side from using its advantages efficiently. If your opponent has artillery, do not give the artillery a stable target. If your opponent has tanks, force those tanks into terrain where they cannot maneuver easily. If your opponent has more troops, avoid battles where numbers can be concentrated. If your opponent has air power, disperse. If your opponent has better surveillance, camouflage, and move. The logic is simple. Execution is not. Finland applied versions of that logic throughout the Winter War. Häyhä applied it within the few hundred meters around his rifle. And this is the deeper reason his story survived. He became a symbol of the possibility that skill could complicate strength. Not defeat strength automatically, not erase numerical superiority, but complicate it, delay it, punish mistakes, force adaptation. That distinction matters because eventually the Soviet military did adapt. More artillery, better coordination, more deliberate planning, greater concentration of force. Finnish defenses began to crack, and this reveals perhaps the most uncomfortable truth in the entire story. Tactical brilliance cannot always solve strategic imbalance. You can win dozens of engagements and still face an enemy with greater reserves. You can inflict enormous casualties and still lose territory. You can produce legendary soldiers and still be forced to negotiate. War does not reward courage automatically. It does not reward skill automatically. It rewards the side that can continue converting resources into effective power long enough to achieve political objectives. Finland survived as a state, but it paid heavily for that survival. Thousands of families lost relatives. Communities were displaced. Territory changed hands. Homes that had existed for generations suddenly stood on the other side of a new border. For Häyhä, the war did not end as a clean victory story. He survived with permanent injuries. His country remained independent, but the landscape he had defended had changed forever. That complexity is important because legends often remove consequences. They simplify war into winners and losers, heroes and villains, Great shots and dramatic numbers. Reality is harder. A soldier can perform extraordinarily well, while the strategic situation deteriorates. An army can fight brilliantly and still be outmatched. A country can preserve independence while losing territory, and a survivor can return home carrying damage that no battlefield statistic can describe. This is why the image of Häyhä standing quietly in white camouflage has endured. It captures a contradiction. He looks almost invisible, yet history made him famous. He fought with a relatively simple rifle, yet he became associated with extraordinary lethality. He was one soldier in a war involving hundreds of thousands. Yet decades later, his name became known across the world. And perhaps the greatest contradiction is this. The more famous the legend became, the easier it became to forget the discipline that actually created it. There was no supernatural ability, no secret weapon, no magical trick. There was preparation, repetition, terrain, patience, and the ability to remain calm while everything around him was trying to force a mistake. That may be the most important revelation of the White Death. The legend is frightening because it sounds impossible. The reality is more unsettling because it was built from ordinary skills practiced to an extraordinary level. A farmer learned to shoot. A hunter learned to wait. A reservist learned his terrain. Then history placed those abilities inside one of the harshest wars of the 20th century. And suddenly,
10,
ordinary
9,
preparation
8,
produced extraordinary
7,
consequences.
6,
More
5,
than 80
we have
years
ready to start.
military
2,
technology
1,
has changed
0.
almost beyond.
Booster ignition and liftoff of Shuttle
Satellites
Endeavour
watch
with
battlefields.
NASA's final space station crew compartment
Drones can
that brings a bay
identify
window view
movement
to our
from
celestial
kilometers away.
backyard.
Thermal cameras can see through darkness. Precision-guided weapons can strike coordinates that previous generations could barely locate. Artificial intelligence is increasingly used to process enormous amounts of
flight to the International Space Station.
But none of those systems eliminate the central competition Häyhä understood: detection against concealment, speed against patience, technology against adaptation, power against knowledge. Every new sensor creates a new method of hiding. Every new weapon creates a new countermeasure. Every battlefield advantage begins a search for the weakness inside that advantage. That cycle has existed for centuries. It will continue. And somewhere inside that technological battlefield, the old lessons remain. Now the terrain. Understand the enemy's habits. Control your signature. Do not reveal yourself without purpose. Move when necessary. Wait when waiting gives you the advantage. And never confuse having more power with being able to use that power effectively. Simo Häyhä did not become one of history's most famous snipers because he dominated an entire war. He became famous because he mastered one narrow part of it with extraordinary precision: the forest, the snow, the rifle, the moment. That was his battlefield. And within that tiny space, the enormous machinery of war was reduced to something brutally simple: one person trying to detect another before being detected himself. That is where the mythology ends. And the real story begins, because the White Death was never really about death alone. It was about concealment, adaptation, discipline, and the terrifying power of a soldier who understands his environment better than the people hunting him. If military history teaches us anything, it is that the strongest force on paper is not always the strongest force at the exact place and moment where the battle is decided. Sometimes the deciding factor is a tank. Sometimes it is artillery. Sometimes it is logistics. And sometimes, in a frozen forest where an army expects nothing but snow and silence, it is one patient soldier who has already been waiting for hours.